You're watching the Everything Network. At the start of the 20th century, Boston was a city divided not just by neighborhoods, but by ethnicity and economy. Its ports and warehouses were the lungs of New England's commerce, and its underworld mirrored that structure, organized along lines of blood, parish, and block. The Irish dominated South Boston and Charlestown. The Italians ruled the North End. Smaller enclaves of Poles, Jews, and Armenians worked the fringes of smuggling and policy rackets. The boundaries between these worlds were clear, and violations were often settled with fists or guns. Out of these neighborhoods came the first rough figures who would shape Boston's criminal landscape. Long before the words Winter Hill became shorthand for power, there were dockside brawlers and bookmakers who ran their businesses under the radar of a police force often as corrupt as the men it chased. By the 1920s, with Prohibition in full effect, bootleggers from Somerville and Charlestown were running liquor north from Providence and south from Canada, paying off patrolmen and aldermen to keep the routes clear. The Irish gangs were particularly entrenched. In South Boston, the Southie crowd controlled the waterfront. In Charlestown, they managed small-scale rackets built around protection and card games. Italians, led by figures aligned with the Patriarca family of Providence, and, by extension, the New York Five families, controlled Little Italy's gambling dens and nightclubs. The uneasy coexistence of these two underworld cultures defined Boston's criminal order for decades. After World War II, as returning veterans filled the city's bars and labor unions, a new generation of Irish mobsters began consolidating control in Somerville, a working-class city north of Boston, known for its tight-knit neighborhoods and hard men. Among them was James "Buddy" McLean, a compact, charismatic figure who had grown up on the streets and learned early how to command loyalty. McLean's crew operated out of the Winter Hill section of Somerville, running bookmaking, loans, and small protection schemes. To the south, in South Boston, another figure had been building his own empire. Donald Killeen, a bookmaker with political protection and a reputation for quiet ruthlessness. The Killeen brothers, Donald, Edward, and George, were known for their grip on Southie's illegal gambling operations and for their muscle in labor disputes. Donald, the eldest, ran the business from his base at the Transit Cafe. Their enforcer, William "Billy" O'Sullivan, was the family's real strength, a man equally capable with a gun or a negotiation, respected on both sides of the law. The Killeens and McLeans began as allies, but the geography of Boston's rackets made conflict inevitable. Somerville's bookmakers overlapped with Southie's bettors, and both sides vied for control of Charlestown, a small but lucrative hub for illegal numbers and loans. In the early 1950s, a series of disputes over unpaid debts and territorial encroachment escalated into a cycle of retaliatory assaults. The police, hampered by lack of witnesses and their own corruption, could do little to stop it. By the late 1950s, the city's underworld was openly divided. The Killeen gang controlled South Boston and parts of Dorchester, while the McLean crew dominated Somerville and Cambridge. Both maintained uneasy relationships with the Italian mafia, particularly the Patriarca family, which oversaw New England's organized crime from its headquarters in Providence. The Italians preferred stability. Street wars were bad for business. But the Irish were driven less by profit than by pride and neighborhood loyalty. The first major shot in what became known as the Boston Irish Gang War was fired in 1961. One of McLean's close associates was beaten by Killeen men in a dispute over loan territory. Days later, one of the Killeen's bookmakers was found shot in his car outside Dorchester. The truce that followed lasted barely a month. In 1962, George McLaughlin, a volatile drunk aligned with the Killeens, was badly beaten by McLean's men after making a pass at one of their girlfriends at a nightclub. The assault enraged the McLaughlins, another Irish clan based in Charlestown, and loosely tied to the Killeens. In retaliation, the McLaughlins ambushed and killed one of McLean's friends, a man named Bernie McLaughlin, outside a Charlestown bar. The killing ignited a full-scale war between the Somerville-based Winter Hill crew and the Charlestown faction. The conflict, fought with pistols and shotguns in alleys and side streets, claimed more than a dozen lives over the next 3 years. William S. O'Sullivan, the Killeens' top enforcer, became a target early. On October 24, 1964, he was ambushed and shot outside his house in Wollaston, Quincy. He died 2 days later, one of the most prominent casualties of the war. His death crippled the Killeens' muscle and demoralized their South Boston allies. Donald Killeen himself survived several attempts on his life, but was living on borrowed time. In May 1972, he was murdered in his driveway, his body riddled with bullets. The killing effectively ended the Killeen line and shifted the balance of power permanently towards Somerville. The man who emerged to unify the Irish rackets under a single banner was Howard Thomas, Howie Winter, a former McLean associate and one of the few gangsters of his era capable of bridging the generational divide between old-school brawlers and modern racketeers. Winter's leadership transformed the disorganized Irish factions into a single syndicate, the Winter Hill Gang, named for the neighborhood that had produced it. Under his rule, the gang adopted the structure and discipline of the Italian mafia while maintaining the flexibility of a street crew. Winter's lieutenants handled everything from gambling and hijacking to labor racketeering and loan sharking. They worked closely with bookmakers across New England, including Rhode Island, figures tied to the Patriarca family. What set Winter apart was his pragmatism. He knew that open warfare was bad for business, and he forged temporary truces with surviving McLaughlin and Charlestown remnants. The Patriarca family, then led by Raymond L.S. Patriarca, recognized Winter as a useful ally, a man who could stabilize Boston's Irish underworld and keep the city's rackets productive. Patriarca's control of the New England Mafia, centered in Providence's Federal Hill, extended tentacles into Boston through gambling and union control. In Winter, he found a partner who would not challenge his supremacy. By the early 1970s, the Winter Hill Gang was at its peak. Its members operated with impunity, paying off police and politicians. They ran horse racing bets, extorted bars, and loaned money at interest rates that guaranteed dependence. For a time, they were more organized than the Italians, and their influence stretched into legitimate construction and real estate businesses. But the peace was temporary. Beneath the surface, the seeds of the gang's eventual destruction were already being planted. The new generation of criminals entering Winter Hill, men like Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy, and James Whitey Bulger, would bring with them the ambition and recklessness that Howie Winter had carefully avoided. Their rise would pull the gang into the glare of federal attention and corrupt it from within. Still, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Winter Hill was the most powerful Irish syndicate in America. It had outlasted the Killeens and the McLaughlins, subdued Charlestown, and struck a working balance with Providence. The blood spilled in the Killeen-McLean War had given Boston a new underworld order. In the words of one FBI report from 1973, the Somerville organization operates as a local government. There is no violence without permission, no territory without tax. For the moment, the city was at peace, a fragile calm between wars. By 1970, Boston's underworld had reached an uneasy equilibrium. The McLean and Killeen wars were over, the Charlestown faction shattered, and the Somerville crew stood alone atop the city's rackets. The victory was not celebrated, it was consolidated. Howie Winter, methodical and unsentimental, treated power as a responsibility. He had watched too many men die for street corners. His goal was to convert that blood into stability. Winter surrounded himself with men who understood organization. Beneath him were bookmakers, loan sharks, and enforcers who had learned from the chaos of the 1960s that discipline was survival. They controlled Somerville, Cambridge, Medford, and a share of South Boston through proxies. Gambling revenues flowed from local bars to collection houses, and from there into legitimate fronts, vending companies, trucking outfits, construction firms. Winter's genius lay not in brutality, but in blending crime with bureaucracy. The Italian mafia of New England, the Patriarca family, recognized the efficiency. Raymond Patriarca, aging but still sharp, allowed Winter broad latitude so long as tribute flowed south to Providence. The arrangement mirrored the larger Cosa Nostra system that dominated the American underworld in those years, autonomy in exchange for order. The line between Irish and Italian rackets blurred. Patriarca's cap regimes in Boston, such as Jerry Angiulo, operated out of the North End, while Winter controlled the working-class suburbs. They occasionally overlapped on loans or betting, but both sides preferred cooperation. The truce economy, as one FBI memorandum later called it, produced consistent profits and almost no bodies. It was during this quiet new figures emerged, men whose influence would ultimately redefine the Winter Hill Gang. One was Stephen Flemmi, nicknamed the Rifleman for his military marksmanship. A decorated Korean War veteran, Flemmi returned home to find legitimate work scarce and the underworld profitable. He had begun under the McLean outfit, then drifted toward the Italians, working for Raymond Patriarca on contract hits and smuggling. By the early 1970s, he had aligned with Winter, bringing with him connections to both sides of the criminal divide. Flemmi's precision and calm made him invaluable. His growing rapport with law enforcement would, in time, make him dangerous. Another was James Whitey Bulger, a South Boston native, recently released from federal prison after serving time for armed robbery and a stint in Alcatraz. Bulger's reputation preceded him, intelligent, manipulative, and fearless. He had once run with the Killeen crew and claimed vengeance for their demise. Under Howie Winter, he found opportunity, a seat at the table without the burden of leadership. Bulger and Flemmi quickly became allies, drawn together by pragmatism. They understood that information, not violence, was the new currency. Each began cultivating contacts inside the Boston field office of the FBI, exploiting the Bureau's growing obsession with dismantling the Italian mafia. To federal agents, the Irish gangs were secondary. To Bulger and Flemmi, that blind spot was gold. While Winter managed the books, his lieutenants diversified operations. The gang expanded into loan sharking, horse race betting, and increasingly narcotics distribution. The profits were staggering. Bookmakers across New England paid tribute for protection. Truck hijackings out of Logan Airport and the New York corridor fed a steady black market economy. Winter's men laundered money through real estate developments in Somerville and nightclubs in Revere. For nearly a decade, Winter Hill prospered without serious challenge, but success bred scrutiny. In 1975, a federal investigation into horse race fixing at the Boston Garden led agents to the gang's betting network. Wiretaps captured Winter's subordinates coordinating wagers and bribes to manipulate race outcomes. The scandal implicated prominent jockeys, trainers, and bookmakers across multiple states. The eventual indictments marked the first major federal strike against the organization. When Howie Winter and several lieutenants were convicted in 1979, leadership passed, unofficially but decisively, to Bulger and Flemmi. Their ascent transformed Winter Hill from a structured syndicate into something darker, a partnership between gangsters and federal informants. Bulger's alliance with the FBI was both unprecedented and corrosive. His handler, Special Agent John Connolly, had grown up in South Boston and viewed Bulger as a local legend. Connolly's ambition to dismantle the Patriarca family aligned neatly with Bulger's wish to eliminate competition. Through the 1980s, Bulger fed the Bureau intelligence on the Angiulo brothers and other Italian figures, while the FBI shielded his own operations from scrutiny. The arrangement devastated Boston's Italian mob. In 1983-84, federal raids crippled Jerry Angiulo's North End base, ending decades of mafia dominance in the city. Publicly, the Bureau celebrated victory over Cosa Nostra. Privately, Bulger expanded into their abandoned rackets, extorting bookmakers, infiltrating unions, and taking control of drug territory once considered off-limits. Howie Winter, meanwhile, watched from prison as his old organization mutated into something unrecognizable. He had believed in quiet profit. Bulger believed in absolute control. By the mid-1980s, Winter Hill was synonymous not with Somerville's old guard professionalism, but with Bulger's reign of intimidation. Murders once forbidden under Winter became common tools of discipline. Victims were buried in basements and marshes from Dorchester to Quincy. Stephen Flemy's dual life deepened the gang's entanglement with federal agencies. Like Bulger, he was secretly registered as an FBI informant. Each fed the Bureau information on the other, a paradox that ensured mutual survival while corrupting the agency from within. Internal FBI memos from the era, later revealed in court, showed that both men were protected assets, even as bodies piled up around them. Through the 1980s, Boston's underworld entered a new phase of instability. The once distinct lines between Irish and Italian factions blurred entirely. The Patriarca family, now under Raymond J. Patriarca Jr. and later Francis Cadillac Frank Salemi, fought to reclaim lost territory, sparking intermittent violence across the city. Salem, a seasoned enforcer with ties to Providence and the Angelos, attempted to rebuild the mafia's presence through alliances and targeted killings. Each move drew counter-pressure from Bulger's expanding empire. The Boston mob wars of the late 1980s and early 1990s were fought as much through information and indictments as through gunfire. The Patriarca family splintered between loyalists to Salemi and those aligned with other killers. Federal agents, often misled by informants, played one side against the other. Winter Hill, protected by corrupted intelligence pipelines, exploited the chaos to dominate extortion and drugs. Violence nonetheless persisted. Among the notable casualties were mafia associate Michael Donovan and bookmaker John Callahan, whose death in 1982 would later be traced to Bulger and Flemmy. The city's newspapers chronicled the killings with detached familiarity. Another body in a car, another unsolved case in a war the public only half understood. By the early 1990s, the arrangement began to collapse. Congressional scrutiny of the FBI's informant program exposed years of misconduct. Agents who had shielded Bulger faced internal investigation. Salema, once a hunted fugitive, re-emerged as boss of the Patriarca family and sought revenge for prior betrayals. Federal prosecutors reopened long-dormant murder cases tied to Winter Hill. The end came, not with a gunfight, but with subpoenas. Flemmy was arrested in 1995. Bulger, tipped off by his FBI contacts, fled Boston days before his indictment. His flight marked the symbolic death of the Winter Hill Gang as an organized force. What remained were fragments, aging bookmakers, imprisoned soldiers, and memories of a time when the Irish underworld ruled the city. By the early 1990s, the lines that had once defined Boston's criminal landscape were blurred beyond recognition. The Irish mob was no longer the tight-knit organization that Howie Winter had built. It was a patchwork of fugitives, informants, and aging bookmakers operating on borrowed time. The Italian mafia, fractured by internal betrayal and federal pressure, was equally weakened. Yet in this vacuum, violence did not disappear. It shifted, turning inward, consuming what little structure remained. The Patriarca crime family, once the dominant force in New England, had spent the 1980s in disarray. The death of Raymond Patriarca in 1984 ended a half-century of centralized leadership. His son, Raymond Patriarca Jr., lacked his father's discipline and was quickly challenged by ambitious underbosses, including Francis Cadillac Frank Salema. Salemi was a survivor, a hitman who had lived through the old wars, jailed for attempting to assassinate a lawyer tied to a federal case. Upon release, he maneuvered into control of the Boston faction, vowing to restore the family's dominance. But Salemi faced a city transformed. The FBI's top echelon informant program had compromised nearly every major player in the Boston underworld. The Angiulo brothers were imprisoned. Flemmi was cooperating in secret. Bulger, though still free, operated under increasing suspicion as investigations into the FBI's corruption widened. The press began to connect the dots: unsolved murders, missing witnesses, and agents accused of favoritism. What had once been whispered in backrooms now filled headlines. For Salemi, rebuilding the Patriarca family required confronting two enemies at once: the federal government and the ghosts of Winter Hill. His strategy was pragmatic: restore old revenue streams, reassert control over gambling, and re-establish discipline through selective violence. The family's hierarchy was reconstituted, with Salemi as boss, Robert "Bobby" DeLuca as underboss, and others managing Rhode Island and Massachusetts. In 1991, the fragile order was shattered again. William "Billy" Grasso, Salemi's underboss and a key enforcer, was found murdered near Providence. The killing triggered another internal war within the New England Mafia. Investigators later determined it was tied to factional disputes over leadership succession. Salemi retaliated quickly, ordering hits to consolidate control. For the first time in years, the Mafia and remnants of Winter Hill were killing again in the streets of Boston and Providence. The FBI, desperate to restore credibility, launched an unprecedented wave of indictments under the RICO statutes. The cases targeted both Italian and Irish figures, a unified offensive against organized crime in New England. Yet even these prosecutions were tainted. Defense attorneys uncovered evidence that Bulger and Flemmi had been protected informants for decades, shielded while committing murders. The revelation humiliated the Bureau and erased years of supposed victories. In 1995, the walls finally closed in. Flemmi was arrested on federal racketeering charges. Facing potential death sentences, he began cooperating, revealing the full extent of the FBI's collusion. His testimony detailed how Bulger had been warned of every investigation and allowed to eliminate rivals with impunity. Within days of Flemmi's arrest, James "Whitey" Bulger vanished. Tipped off by his handler John Connolly, he fled Boston, leaving behind an empire in ruins. Bulger's disappearance marked the symbolic end of the Winter Hill Gang. What had begun under James McLean and Howie Winter as an organized, quasi-traditional syndicate dissolved into memory. The men who remained, bookmakers, loan collectors, old soldiers, operated quietly, their influence shrinking as younger criminal groups from other ethnic backgrounds filled the void. Meanwhile, Salemi's reign over the Patriarca family unraveled under relentless legal pressure. In 1999, he was indicted for racketeering and obstruction of justice. Like Flemmi, he eventually cooperated, testifying in multiple trials that exposed decades of mafia operations in Boston and Providence. The old code of silence, once the foundation of both Italian and Irish power, was gone. The last of the Boston mob wars were fought not in alleys, but in courtrooms. Prosecutors reconstructed the killings of the 1960s and 1970s from witness testimony and forensic evidence. Jurors listened to stories of men buried in shallow graves and women strangled to silence them. For the public, these trials confirmed what rumors had long suggested, that the city's law enforcement had been as compromised as the criminals they pursued. Francis Roach, police commissioner, took office during this period of reckoning. A career officer, he inherited a department struggling with corruption and scandal. His tenure from 1985 to 1993 symbolized a broader effort to reform Boston's justice system after decades of collusion between police, politicians, and organized crime. Under Roach, internal affairs investigations expanded and cooperation with federal task forces improved. Yet even he acknowledged that the damage was generational. The city had lived too long under a system where fear and familiarity blurred the line between law and crime. By the early 2000s, the Winter Hill Gang existed only as a historical term. Howie Winter, released from prison, lived quietly, giving occasional interviews in which he downplayed his legacy. "We were businessmen," he told reporters, "not gangsters." Few believed him, but fewer still wanted to argue. Whitey Bulger, after 16 years on the run, was captured in Santa Monica in 2011. His arrest reopened wounds that had never fully healed. During his trial, prosecutors presented a ledger of violence spanning 4 decades, 19 murders, countless extortions, and a partnership with federal agents that blurred the moral boundaries of justice. Bulger was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, dying behind bars in 2018. The same year, Frank Salemi was convicted of ordering the 1993 murder of a nightclub owner. Once the boss of the New England Mafia, he ended his life as another relic of a lost order, a reminder that in Boston, power had always come with a short half-life. The story of the Boston mob, and of the Winter Hill Gang in particular, is one of transformation. What began as an ethnic underworld born of poverty and isolation evolved into a sophisticated criminal network and finally collapsed under its own ambition. The wars, Killeen against McLean, Winter against the law, Bulger against the system, were less about territory than identity. Each generation sought to define itself against the last, and each inherited its corruption. In the smoky bars of the North End, the voices were low, the deals unspoken. The men who ran Boston's underworld didn't need headlines or titles. They were soldiers, enforcers, killers, intermediaries, the invisible machinery of a system that lived beneath the surface of the city. This was the world of Ilario Zannino, Joseph Barboza, and Vincent Flemmi. 3 names whispered in fear across East Boston and Charlestown. They worked for the Patriarca crime family, the New England arm of La Cosa Nostra, and together they embodied the contradictions of that time: loyalty and betrayal, silence and exposure, brutality and bureaucracy. Boston's underworld in the early 1960s was an uneasy balance of power. The Italian mafia ruled the North End and controlled much of the racketeering in the region, from Rhode Island to Maine. Its boss, Raymond L.S. Patriarca, ran his empire not from Boston, but from Providence, operating behind a cigar store on Atwells Avenue. From that modest front, he managed bookmakers, loan sharks, and enforcers through a hierarchy modeled on the 5 families of New York. Under him were trusted lieutenants, Jerry Angiulo in Boston, Henry Tamilio, and his consigliere, Ilario Larry Bayone Zannino. Zannino was quiet, impeccably dressed, and efficient. To outsiders, he appeared like a businessman. To those who knew better, he was the family's most disciplined killer. Zannino had come up hard. Born in East Boston in 1914, he was a street hustler who graduated into racketeering in the 1940s. By the 1960s, he was Patriarca's liaison to the Angiulo crew and the man responsible for settling disputes among local soldiers. His authority was absolute. Those who defied him rarely lived long enough to regret it. In the same city, operating under the mafia's shadow, a different breed of soldier was emerging, volatile, violent, and less controlled. Among them were Joseph Barboza and Vincent Jimmy Flemmi. Barboza was unlike any other figure in Boston's criminal world. A Portuguese-American from New Bedford, he fought as a boxer before turning to crime. He was intelligent, articulate, and terrifyingly unstable, a man who could charm a judge one minute and kill a man the next. His nickname, the Animal, was not a metaphor. It was earned through sheer ferocity. Vincent Flemmi, older brother of Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi, was no less dangerous. He was impulsive, sadistic, and loyal only to himself. Both men served as freelance hitmen for the Patriarca family, used when intimidation failed or messages needed to be written in blood. They were the blunt instruments of a refined machine. By 1964, Patriarca's control over Boston was under pressure. The Irish crews in Charlestown and Somerville, precursors to the Winter Hill Gang, were expanding. Federal investigations were growing more sophisticated. The FBI, desperate to penetrate organized crime, began cultivating informants inside the Patriarca network. Among those secretly recruited, Vincent Flemmi and Joseph Barboza. That dual loyalty to the Mafia and to the Bureau was a time bomb. The FBI viewed Barboza and Flemmi as weapons in its campaign to dismantle Cosa Nostra. What it failed to grasp was that both men were also feeding information to Zannino and the Angulos, manipulating their handlers to eliminate personal enemies. This convergence of ambition and corruption would lead directly to one of the most infamous murders in Boston's criminal history. The target was Edward Teddy Deegan, a small-time hood and part-time burglar who had crossed the wrong men. Deegan, connected loosely to the North End underworld, had bragged about robbing mafia-linked warehouses. It was enough to sign his death warrant. On the night of March 12, 1965, Deegan was lured to an alley in Chelsea under the pretense of a burglary. Waiting for him were 6 men, among them Barboza and Flemmi. As Deegan stepped into the dim light, the shooters opened fire. He was hit multiple times and left dead in the gutter. Witnesses heard nothing but the echo of engines as the killers sped off into the cold Boston night. The murder, though one of dozens in a violent decade, would become a flashpoint. Within days, the FBI began shaping a narrative, one that protected its informants and redirected suspicion toward rivals. Using Barboza's testimony, federal prosecutors built a case that sent 4 men, Henry Tamilio, Louis Greco, Peter Lamone, and Joseph Salvati, to prison for life. None of them had been at the scene. Zannino, though known to have approved the hit, escaped prosecution. The Bureau considered him too valuable as a potential source. Flemmi, who had participated directly, was protected as an informant, and Barboza, the government's star witness, was rewarded with a new identity. For years, the conviction stood as another apparent victory in the federal war on organized crime. But inside the Mafia, the truth was well known. Deegan's killing had been ordered by Zannino, carried out by Flemmi and Barboza, and sanctioned by Patriarca's lieutenants. The 4 men imprisoned were pawns in a much larger game, collateral in the Bureau's obsession with dismantling La Cosa Nostra at any cost. Zannino continued to operate with impunity. Through the late 1960s and 1970s, he remained Patriarca's consigliere, overseeing extortion and loan sharking while maintaining the veneer of a businessman. He was feared but rarely seen. FBI wiretaps captured his voice, calm, controlled, occasionally chilling. "If you're going to hit him," he once said, "make sure you hit him good. No mistakes." Barboza's story ended more violently. After testifying against the Mafia, he entered the Witness Protection Program, moving to California. But even in exile, his volatility followed him. In 1976, he was shot dead in San Francisco, a final, inevitable consequence of betrayal. Vincent Flemmi's fate was equally grim. Institutionalized and deteriorating mentally, he died in prison in 1979, leaving behind a trail of unsolved murders and sealed FBI files. Years later, when internal Justice Department reviews exposed the corruption surrounding the Deegan case, the truth emerged. The 4 men wrongly convicted spent more than 3 decades in prison before being exonerated. In 2007, a federal court awarded them and their families more than $100 million in damages, one of the largest wrongful conviction settlements in U.S. history. The case became a symbol of how deeply organized crime had entangled itself with law enforcement, how the pursuit of one enemy had empowered another. It showed that in Boston's underworld, loyalty was an illusion. Everyone was expendable, from street soldier to federal agent. By the 1980s, the names Zannino, Barboza, and Flemmi had become shorthand for the brutality of an era. Zannino, arrested in 1983 in a sweeping RICO indictment, was sentenced to 30 years in prison and died behind bars in 1996. His death marked the end of a generation. men who had built empires on fear and precision, yet their legacy remains woven into the history of Boston. The Degan murder exposed the corruption of the FBI, reshaped federal policy, and haunted every investigation that followed. Barbosa's duplicity redefined the meaning of informant. Flemmi's collaboration with both sides foreshadowed the larger scandals of his brother Stephen and Whitey Bulger. Today, when historians trace the arc of organized crime in New England, they mark 1965 as the turning point, the year when the myth of control gave way to chaos. The Degan case, and the men who made it possible, revealed the underworld not as a hierarchy, but as a mirror of the institutions meant to contain it, flawed, ambitious, and doomed by its own contradictions. You're watching the Everything Network. The Killeen brothers, Donald, Kenneth, George, and Edward, were an Irish-American crime family which ran the bookmaking and loan sharking in South Boston, Massachusetts. They used muscle to make collections and to make examples of those who didn't pay in a timely fashion. The Mullins, by contrast, were a loosely organized crew of thieves. But being in the South, it was just a matter of time before they butted heads with the Killeens. The Mullins gang were mostly thieves who stole from the ships that brought goods into Boston Harbor and from the warehouses where they were stored. The crew was particularly talented and opportunistic, as likely to steal a truckload of Easter hams as one of televisions. They also had strength in numbers. The Boston Police Department at one time estimated there were as many as 60 members. In 1971, Donald Killeen's younger brother, Kenneth, bit off the nose of Mickey Dwyer, a member of the rival Mullen gang, at the Transit, a local watering hole. Paulie McGonigal, Francis Buddy Leonard, Thomas King, and Dennis Buddy Roche went to the Transit, the Killeen gang's main base of operations, looking to confront the Killeens, who had already left the bar. The presence of the Mullins at the Killeens' headquarters was viewed as a direct challenge by Donald Killeen. A gangland war soon resulted, leading to a string of slayings throughout Boston and the surrounding suburbs. Several weeks following the Transit incident, Killeen enforcers Billy O'Sullivan and Whitey Bulger encountered Mullen member Buddy Roach, brother of future police commissioner Francis Mickey Roach, in a bar on Broadway in South Boston. After a heated argument, Roach was shot and left paralyzed for life. A short time later, Bulger and O'Sullivan killed Donald McGonigal. Donald was not a member of the Mullins and was killed by mistake. His brother, Paulie McGonigal, vowed revenge and, according to Patrick Nee, personally murdered O'Sullivan near his house at Savin Hill at just past midnight on the morning of March 28, 1971. The killing of O'Sullivan revitalized the Mullins, and the Killeens quickly found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. On May 13, 1972, South Boston mob boss Donald Killeen was shot to death by Mullen gang enforcer Jimmy Mantville outside his home in suburban Framingham, Massachusetts. The leadership of the Killeen faction then devolved on Bulger, who was in hiding on Cape Cod. Rather than murdering Bulger as some Mullins, including Paulie McGonigal, desired, Patrick Nee arranged for their dispute to be mediated by Howie Winter, the godfather of the Irish-American Winter Hill Gang of Somerville, and Joseph Russo of the Patriarcha crime family. After a sit-down at Chandler's Restaurant in the South End, Boston, the two gangs joined forces with Winter as overall boss. By 1973, Bulger was in control of the rackets in South Boston. He began to use his influence to remove opposition by persuading Winter to sanction the murders of those rivals whom he viewed as having stepped out of line. These included former Mullins Spike O'Toole and Paulie McGonigal, who was murdered by Bulger and buried in a shallow grave in Boston's Tenian Beach. It is also alleged that Bulger had direct involvement in the murders of Eddie Connors in January 1975 and Mullins' Tommy King and Buddy Leonard in November 1975. Paulie McGonigal died November 1974, was a Boston mobster and one-time leader of the Mullen Gang, a South Boston street gang involved in burglary, auto theft, and armed robbery. During the war against Donald Killeen and his brothers, McGonigal successfully led the Mullens in a string of shootings which finally ended with Killeen's murder in 1972. After a truce was arranged with Whitey Bulger and the remnants of the Killeen organization, McGonigal remained angry about Bulger's accidental murder of his fraternal twin brother, Donald McGonigal. It is believed that this was one of the reasons for his disappearance in November 1974. His body was later excavated from a shallow grave on Boston's Tenian Beach. Tommy King, died 1975, was a Boston mobster and member of the Mullens during their gang war against Donald Killeen and his lieutenants Billy O'Sullivan and James J. Bulger during the early 1970s. Following Killeen's murder in 1972, he became an associate of Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang after his alleged involvement in the death of Paul McGonigal. In 1975, he disappeared following an altercation with Bulger in a Southie watering hole. He was suspected of having been killed by hitman John Martorano. Patrick Nee was born to an Irish-speaking family in Rosmuck, Ireland in 1944. He was brought to the US by his parents in 1952 and became a member of the Mullen Gang at the age of 14. He fought in several turf battles before joining the US Marine Corps. He arrived in Vietnam in 1965 and saw combat at Phu Bai. After his return to South Boston in October 1966, he rejoined the Mullens and became one of their leaders in the war against the Killeen brothers. Nee arranged the truce that ended the war by arranging a sit-down in Boston's South End. After being supplanted by Bulger, he moved to Charlestown, Massachusetts, and switched increasingly to smuggling arms to the Provisional IRA. He currently resides in South Boston and is the author of the memoir, A Criminal and an Irishman. The Patrick Nee truce is as follows. Nobody talked fault, although at first it was tense while we ran down the who killed who list. Whitey was a defeated warrior looking to keep as much honor as possible. He knew the Mullens had courageous, fierce men willing to die for theirs, and he was perceptive. Deep down, Whitey knew that he couldn't take over for the Killeens without cutting the Mullens in on their bookmaking and loan sharking. Tommy King and I felt victorious, but we didn't want to gloat. The meeting lasted for 6 hours. We ate good steaks, chasing them down with nothing stronger than ginger ale. It was business, and contrary to media stereotype, we weren't a bunch of lowlifes who sat around drinking beer all day and all night. The balance of the meeting was spent forming an alliance, and by far the hardest part was deciding whom to protect. After a war, each side usually gets to protect so many people from harm. Those who aren't protected are fair game for retribution and shakedowns. Everything was split down the middle. All the horses, dogs, bookmaking, and loan sharking were now going to be under our mutual control. This was the beginning of our relationship. Whitey and I were now officially partners, and nobody at that table could ever have possibly imagined how this treacherous uck would treat his partners. After Winter was convicted of fixing horse races in 1979, the leadership of the gang fell on James Whitey Bulger. Nee responded by relocating to Charlestown, Massachusetts, and concentrating his energy on raising money and smuggling guns to the Provisional IRA. He has written that Bulger frequently urged him to cut his links to the IRA, saying that it was too great a risk for not enough profit. On July 26, 1983, Nee participated in the homicide of Arthur Bucky Barrett with his criminal associates at Nee's family's house at 799 East 3rd Street in South Boston. Barrett was a bank robber who was believed to have large amounts of untraceable cash and valuables that Nee and his gang wanted to extort from him. Barrett was good friends with brothers James and John Martorano. James Martorano used his friendship with Barrett to convince his friend to come to Patrick's house to look at some stolen diamonds. Instead of diamonds, Barrett walked into Nee's house and encountered Nee and his associates armed with machine guns. Barrett gave Nee and his associates the location of some of his stolen cash. Then Barrett was led to the basement and shot in the head. Nee and Kevin Weeks buried Barrett's body in Nee's dirt cellar. Between 1999 and 2003, U.S. attorneys in Boston immunized 2 of his associates who were present with him at his house that day, and thus learned the details of Barrett's murder. Despite relying on these witnesses to indict other associates who were present, the U.S. attorneys decided not to indict Nee or Martorano. The U.S. attorney's willingness to ignore Nee's involvement in Barrett's murder has fueled speculation that Nee is a protected federal informant. On November 30th, 1984, Nee picked up McIntyre from a bar and lured him to his house with a case of beer and a promise of a party. At this time, Nee knew that McIntyre was cooperating with federal law enforcement in the smuggling of 7.5 tons of automatic weapons, machine guns, rocket launchers, plastic explosives, bullets, and ammunition aboard the Valhalla. 17 months prior, Barrett had been lured to his house and killed there. McIntyre was killed in Nee's house and buried in the cellar next to Barrett's corpse. Nee fled Boston after being informed by Bulger that federal agents were looking for him. After several years in hiding, he was arrested in 1987 and served an 18-month sentence in federal prison. The statutory sentence he faced for possessing and smuggling those 7.5 tons of armaments was life imprisonment. After his release, in 1989, Nee was motivated increasingly by Irish republicanism to cut his links to Whitey. He put together a crew of his own and began planning armored car robberies to raise money for the IRA. He was arrested by the FBI during an armored car robbery in Abington, Massachusetts on January 13, 1990. He was masked and in possession of another machine gun, which again carried a mandatory life sentence. He was sentenced to 37 years in federal prison, but released on April 25, 2000. Federal sentencing guidelines prohibited early release or credit for good behavior in a federal prison. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston has refused to explain Patrick's early release and why they failed to oppose it. In 2003, U.S. Attorneys Fred Wishak and Brian Kelly immunized Nee's associate Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi and participated in Flemmi's debriefing. At that time, Wishak and Kelly learned from Flemmi that Nee had participated in another homicide in January 1985. The victim, Deborah Hussey, was lured to Nee's house at 799 East 3rd Street in South Boston. She was strangled to death and buried in Nee's cellar, alongside Barrett and McIntyre. Wishak and Kelly learned Nee had participated in burying another murder victim, Deborah Davis, in 1981. Wishak and Kelly did not charge Nee in any of these crimes, nor in the Donahue and Halloran murders. Gennaro Angiulo was born in 1919 to Italian immigrants who owned a mom-and-pop grocery store. He grew up with his siblings Niccolo, Donato, Francesco, Antonio, Michele, and James. Even though he was from the North End neighborhood, he graduated from Boston English High School in 1936, where his ambition was to attend Suffolk Law School and become a criminal lawyer. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy at the beginning of World War II and served 4 years in the Pacific Theater. He achieved the rank of Chief Boatswain's Mate. Upon completion of his service, he moved back to the North End of Boston. He had a regular table in the back room of an Italian dinery called Francesca's Restaurant on North Washington Street in North End, Boston. The Angiulo brothers, who had only minor previous involvement in crime, realized that as a result of convictions of previous operators, there was an opening for numbers game operation. They offered small business people, such as barbers and convenience store owners, the opportunity to get a wholesale discount on bets on individual numbers. The Angiulo brothers were able to build a network, converting these businesses into points of sale and bookies. This succeeded in attracting the interest of the mafia, and the Angiulo brothers offered the Patriarca family a cut, rather than resist them. The Angiulo brothers, who owned nightclubs, were publicly named as members of Cosa Nostra, more commonly known as the American Mafia. In 1963, Gennaro's reputation for being a shrewd businessman, along with his successful racketeering, led to Patriarca appointing him underboss of the Providence, Rhode Island-based Patriarca crime family. Angiulo later headed up Boston's underworld from the 1960s to the 1980s. He and his brothers ran the criminal organization out of their headquarters at 98 Prince Street in the North End, the neighborhood in which he grew up. In 1981, the Federal Bureau of Investigation placed wiretaps in the headquarters and at a nearby social club, located at 51 North Margin Street, for 3 months. It was later revealed in a federal court that rival gangsters Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi drew a diagram for FBI agents, telling them where to plant the bugs. As Angiulo was being taken in handcuffs from the restaurant on September 19, 1983, he yelled, "I'll be back before my pork chops get cold." As Angiulo sat in jail without bail, awaiting trial on federal racketeering charges, he was demoted from the mob. At the highly publicized trial, jurors heard hours of taped conversations of Angiulo and his associates planning numerous illegal activities, including murder, gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. In one conversation, Angiulo ordered the killing of a bartender after concluding that he was set to testify before a federal grand jury investigating gambling and loan sharking. The FBI thwarted the plot by warning the witness. At the 8-month-long trial, the mobster often sarcastically commented on the evidence presented and cracked jokes, prompting District Court Judge David Nelson to repeatedly reprimand him. In February 1986, Angiulo and his co-defendants were convicted of all sorts of charges. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison on 12 counts of racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, and obstruction of justice. As his own lawyer, Angiulo argued numerous times unsuccessfully to have his conviction overturned. One argument claimed that he was framed by the FBI, Bulger, and Flemmi. In an affidavit filed in federal court in 2004, he wrote that he was in poor health and his term was tantamount to an illegal death sentence. Angiulo, who had been incarcerated at the Federal Prison Hospital in Devons, was paroled on September 10, 2007. He had been undergoing dialysis treatment since his release while living at his waterfront home in Nahant. Prior to his death, he was spending time with his wife Barbara, with whom he had 3 children, Jason Brion, Gennaro J. Jr., and Barbara J. Angiulo. He died on August 29, 2009, at the Massachusetts General Hospital of kidney failure from kidney disease. His funeral was at the Joseph A. Langone Jr. Funeral Home in Boston's North End. Adolfo Bruno was a serious man in a serious position, strong enough to control Western Massachusetts rackets of the Genovese crime family, but still beneath the New York administration that could make, break, or kill a man in that seat. By the early 2000s, Arthur Negro had risen to acting boss of the Genovese family, and federal prosecutors later said his reach extended from the Bronx into Springfield. That is how a parking lot murder in Massachusetts became a 5 families case in Manhattan federal court. The federal case later laid out Bruno's end in blunt terms. Prosecutors said Negro ordered Bruno killed in November 2003 to increase his own power and position in the family and to punish Bruno for speaking with the FBI. The men who handled the planning on the Springfield side according to the FBI and the US Attorney's Office, were Fotios Freddy Gaius and his brother Ty Gaius, both Genovese associates in Springfield. The official line from the later conviction was that Negro gave the order. Freddy and Ty planned the hit, and a shooter was recruited to carry it out. Bruno was gunned down in Springfield on November 23, 2003. Years later, that killing was still sitting at the center of multiple racketeering trials, life sentences, and prison politics that would stretch all the way to Whitey Bulger's last day alive. The Bruno murder did not stand alone. Once federal prosecutors opened up the Springfield crew and the Negro case, the picture widened into the kind of violent internal file that only a five-families prosecution really captures. Negro, Fotios, and Ty Gaius were also convicted for the November 2003 murder of Gary Westerman in Agawam, Massachusetts, after the government said they believed Westerman was cooperating with state police. They were also convicted in the attempted murder of Frank Dadabo in the Bronx, a shooting Negro ordered over a union-related dispute. On top of that came conspiracy counts tied to Luis Santos, who they believed was cooperating, and Giuseppe Manzi, described in the sentencing release as the leader of a rival criminal faction in Springfield. That is the proper frame for Bruno's story. It was not one isolated mob assassination. It was part of a broader Genovese campaign of internal control, retaliation, and rank building across New York and Massachusetts. Bruno's crew was local in geography, but New York in authority. Negro was the acting boss in New York. Bruno was the Springfield captain. The Gaius brothers were Springfield associates, doing work that prosecutors said served the wider family. The same indictment that carried Bruno's murder also carried extortion and other racketeering crimes in the Genovese structure. In other words, Springfield was not some independent New England sideshow. It was a functioning Massachusetts faction tied into a New York family command. Once Bruno was dead, the old arrangement was finished, and the government's later trials made clear that the fight over Springfield had been treated inside the family as a real power struggle, not a local misunderstanding. The convictions in 2011 closed the legal story for that phase with maximum force. Negro, Fotios, and Ty were all sentenced to life in prison after being convicted of multiple murders, racketeering, extortion, attempted murder, murder conspiracies, and loan sharking. The sentencing release is clear on Bruno's place in the story. It identifies him as a captain in the Genovese family and says Negro ordered the hit to build his own power and punish Bruno for talking to the FBI. It says the Gaius brothers planned the murder and recruited the actual shooter. That sentence package effectively turned the Springfield internal war into a federal monument. Bruno was dead. Negro was buried in prison. The Gaius brothers were buried in prison. The New York leadership had lost one captain, and then lost some of the men who had removed him. Then the story sat for years in prison and waited for another body. James Whitey Bulger arrived at USP Hazleton in West Virginia on October 29, 2018, after a transfer from Florida. By the next morning, he was dead. Reuters reported that Bulger, already serving life after his 2013 conviction, was killed shortly after the transfer. The AP later reported that prosecutors said Fotios and Paul DeCollegiero spent about 7 minutes in Bulger's cell, while Sean McKinnon moved away and then returned. Prosecutors also said inmate witnesses later described Bulger as a snitch, and one witness said DeCollegiero had announced that as soon as Bulger reached their unit, they planned to kill him. The prison killing was not random prison chaos. It was a targeted inmate execution, and the lead name in that execution was the same Fotios who had already gone away for the Bruno murder. That is the Springfield Genovese link in its hardest form. Bulger did not get killed by some nameless inmate with no underworld history. He got killed by a man already serving life for the murder of Adolfo Bruno and Gary Westerman, a man Reuters described as an associate of the Genovese crime family. That gives the prison killing its full organized crime weight. Whitey had spent years as one of the most notorious informants in American mob history, an Irish gang leader who had fed the FBI while his own enemies were being crushed. Gaius had spent years inside the Genovese orbit, where informants and suspected informants had already turned up dead. Put those two histories in one prison unit, and the ending stops feeling accidental very quickly. The prison case eventually ended in pleas and sentences, rather than a murder trial. Reuters reported that in 2024, Gaius pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter after the government dropped more serious murder charges that could have brought life. He was sentenced to 25 years. DiCollegiero, already serving a 25-year racketeering sentence from a Boston gang case, got another 51 months after pleading guilty to assault, resulting in serious bodily injury. McKinnon pleaded guilty to lying to federal agents and got time served. By then, the legal shape of the Bulger case was settled. Gaius was the principal killer in the government's account. DiCollegiero was in the cell with him. McKinnon lied about what he knew. The case had started with murder charges in 2022 and ended with a three-man sequence of plea deals in 2024. There was another side to Bulger's death, and it had nothing to do with mob rank and everything to do with Bureau of Prisons' failure. The DOJ Inspector General said in 2022 that Bulger's killing followed serious management and performance failures at multiple levels, bureaucratic incompetence, and flawed policies. The watchdog found no malicious intent by Bureau of Prisons employees, but it did find failures in communication, transfer processing, medical review, PENRAF, and record handling. AP summarized the result even more plainly. Bulger was placed in general population at a violent prison after a transfer process so poor that the Inspector General said a chain of bureaucratic blunders left him exposed to rival gangsters.
Whitey Bulger was a mobster and former mob boss of the Irish mob. Born in Boston, Massachusetts, he developed a reputation as a thief and street fighter who was fiercely loyal to South Boston. This led to him meeting more experienced criminals and finding more lucrative opportunities. Around age 15, James was arrested and charged with larceny. By then, he had joined a street gang known as the Shamrocks and would eventually be arrested for assault, battery, and armed robbery. He was soon sent to a juvenile reformatory for his crimes. Shortly after his release in April 1948, he joined the U.S. Air Force, where his character continued to show. After his basic training, he was stationed first at the Smoky Hill Air Force Base in Salina, Kansas, then in Idaho. Bulger was sentenced to the stockade for several assaults. He was also arrested in 1950 for going absent without leave. Nevertheless, he received an honorable discharge in 1952 and then returned to Massachusetts. In 1956, he was first sentenced to federal time in Atlanta Penitentiary for armed robbery and hijacking. There, it was alleged, Bulger was involved in the MKUltra program, the goal of which was to research mind-control drugs for the Central Intelligence Agency. For 18 months, he and 18 other inmates, all of whom had volunteered in return for lessened sentences, were given LSD and other drugs. Whitey later complained that he and the other inmates had been recruited by deception and that they were told that they were helping to find a cure for schizophrenia. He was transferred from Atlanta to Alcatraz, arriving on November 2, 1959. He became a close friend of fellow inmate Clarence Carnes, who was the youngest inmate incarcerated at the prison. In November 1962, he was transferred to Leavenworth and in the following year, to Lewisburg. He was released in 1965 after serving 9 years. After his release, he worked as a janitor and construction worker before becoming a bookmaker and loan shark with ties to Donald Killeen, an Irish-American mob boss who controlled criminal activity, primarily bookmaking, in South Boston during the 1960s and 1970s. In 1971, Killeen's younger brother allegedly bit off the nose of Michael Dwyer, a member of the rival Mullen Gang. A gangland war soon erupted, leading to a string of killings throughout Boston and the surrounding suburbs. The Killeens quickly found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by the younger Mullins. It was during the Killeen-Mullen War that Whitey committed what was his first homicide. Paul McGonigal was said to be Whitey's first victim. An informant once said about the killing, "It took James longer than he originally expected. Paulie talked a big game, but he wasn't a shooter. Although he never did anything, he kept on stirring everything up and keeping feuds going with his mouth." so James decided to kill him. One day while the gang war was still going on, Whitey was driving down 7th Street in South Boston when he saw Paulie driving toward him. He pulled up beside him, window to window, nose to nose, and called his name. As Paulie looked over, James shot him right between the eyes. Only at that moment, just as he pulled the trigger, James realized it wasn't Paulie. It was Donald, the most likable of the McGonigal brothers, the only one who wasn't involved in anything. He drove straight to his mentor Billy O'Sullivan's house, who was at the stove cooking, and said, "I shot the wrong one. I shot Donald." Billy looked up from the stove and said, "Don't worry about it. He wasn't healthy anyway. He smoked. He would have gotten lung cancer." According to former Mullen boss, Patrick Nee, Paul was enraged by the murder of his twin brother. Certain that William O'Sullivan was responsible, Paul ambushed and murdered Bulger's partner. The end of the war has usually been related as follows. Bulger, realizing that he was on the losing side, secretly approached Howie Winter, the leader of the Winter Hill Gang. He allegedly told Winter that he could end the fighting in South Boston by murdering the leaders of the Killeen Gang. Shortly thereafter, Donald Killeen was gunned down outside his home in the suburb of Framingham. Nee disputes this claim. According to Nee, the slaying of Donald Killeen on May 13, 1972, was carried out not by Bulger, but by Mullen Gang enforcers, James Manville and Tommy King. Also according to Nee, Whitey and the Killeens fled the city in the aftermath of their boss's murder, fearing that they would be next. Instead of murdering them, Patrick Nee arranged for the dispute to be mediated by Howie Winter and Patriarcha crime family captain, Joseph Russo. In a sit-down at Chandler's restaurant in the South End, the Mullens were represented by Patrick Nee and Tommy King, and the Killeens by Whitey Bulger. Following the sit-down, the two gangs joined forces, with Howie Winter as boss of the entire Irish syndicate. An informant states, "Nobody took fault for the murders, although at first it was tense while we ran down the list of who killed who." Whitey was a defeated warrior, looking to keep as much honor as possible. He knew the Mullens had courageous, fierce men, willing to die for the cause. Deep down, Whitey knew that he couldn't take over the Killeen operations without cutting the Mullens in on their bookmaking and loan sharking. The meeting lasted for 6 hours. We ate good steaks that day. It was business, and contrary to media stereotype, we weren't a bunch of lowlifes who sat around drinking all day and all night. The balance of the meeting was spent forming an alliance, and by far the hardest part was deciding whom to protect. After a war, each side usually gets to protect so many people from harm. Those who aren't protected are fair game for retribution and shakedowns. Everything was split down the middle. All the horses, dogs, bookmaking and loan sharking, and everything else was now going to be under mutual control. This was the beginning of our relationship. Whitey Bulger was now officially a partner, and nobody at that table could ever have possibly imagined how this treacherous snake could fit in. Soon after, Donald Killeen's sole surviving brother, Kenneth Killeen, was jogging in the City Point neighborhood of Boston. Whitey called him over to the car and said, "It's over. You're out of business. No more warnings." Kenneth would later testify at the trial of John Connolly that in the car with Whitey were Winter Hill Gang enforcers, Stephen Flemmi and John Martirano. After the 1972 truce, Bulger and the Mullens gained control of South Boston's criminal underworld. The FBI noted in September of 1973 that Bulger and Nee had been heavily shaking down the neighborhood's bookmakers and loan sharks. During the years that followed, Whitey began to remove opposition by persuading Howie Winter to sanction the killings of those who stepped out of line. In a 2004 interview, Winter recalled that the highly intelligent Bulger could teach the devil tricks. During this era, his victims included Mullen Gang veteran Spike O'Toole, Paulie McGonigal and Tommy King. As a criminal, he made a point of only preying upon criminals as opposed to ordinary people. When things couldn't be worked out to his satisfaction with these people, other options had been explored. He wouldn't hesitate to use violence. Certainly, if he thought there was a chance of this person coming back to cause him some harm, there was no sense in bothering to give him a beating, he might as well kill him. And he did. Tommy King, in 1975, was one example. Tommy's problems began when he and Whitey had worked in Triple O's. Tommy, who was a Mullens, made a threat towards Whitey, and James knew about it. The next day, Tommy went to the old colony projects, where James was living with his mother, and tried to make amends. He said he had been drunk and hadn't meant what he had said the night before. James told him, "Don't worry about it, just forget the whole thing." A week later, Tommy was dead. Tommy's second and last mistake had been getting into the car with James, Stevie, and John Martirano. That night, James put Tommy in the passenger seat with Stevie and Johnny in the back seat and told him they were looking for someone to kill. That someone, of course, was Tommy. As they were driving around, Tommy banged on his supposedly bulletproof flak jacket and joked, "If we don't find him, we can try this out." The minute he finished the joke, Johnny shot him in the head from the back seat. The bullet went right through his head, splattering blood all over the place, but Whitey just reached over, propped Tommy up, and put a baseball cap on his bloody head. A minute later, Johnny said he had to make a phone call and asked Whitey to pull over by the Dunkin' Donuts in Quincy. He was gone a few minutes, supposedly to make a bet, then got back in the car and the four of them drove off. Whitey drove around for a few minutes and then found a spot on the nearest river where they buried Tommy. Later that same night, Bulcher killed mob associate Buddy Leonard and left him and Tommy's car in rival territory to confuse the authorities. Before he was killed, Tommy King had threatened a Boston police detective that he was going to kill him. Knowing Tommy's violent reputation and that he was a capable guy, the detective was afraid of him. James met with the detective, who was a tenacious investigator, and promised to talk to Tommy and make him listen to reason. If Tommy wouldn't listen to him, James said, he would put himself between Tommy and the detective to defuse the situation and make sure no harm came to the detective. About a week later, Jimmy informed the detective that he no longer had a problem. He told him Tommy hadn't listened to him, but he didn't have to worry about anything, that Tommy would no longer bother him. The truth was that even though Tommy King had made the threats, when James met with the detective, Tommy had already been dead for 2 weeks. James had ended up using Tommy's death as leverage with this detective. He had become friends with him by letting him think Tommy was gone on his behalf. It was another case of Whitey's Machiavellian side, turning a potentially bad situation to his advantage. In 1979, Howie Winter was arrested, along with many members of his inner circle, on charges of fixing horse races. Bulcher and his then-partner Stephen Flemmi were left out of the indictments. They stepped into the vacuum and took over leadership of the gang. They transferred its headquarters to the Lancaster Street Garage in Boston, near the Boston Garden in the North End. In 1971, the FBI, searching for reliable information in their battle against the Patriarca crime family, approached James and attempted to recruit him as an informant. FBI Special Agent Dennis Condon was assigned to make the pitch. However, Condon reported that James was too concerned about his own safety to start working with him. In 1974, Whitey became partners with Stephen Flemmi, an Italian-American mobster and FBI informant since 1965. Although it is a documented fact that Whitey followed in Flemmi's footsteps, exactly how and why continues to be debated. Special Agent John Connolly frequently boasted to his fellow agents about how he had recruited the mobster at a late-night meeting at Williston Beach inside an FBI-issue car. Connolly allegedly said that the bureau could help in his feud with Mafia underboss Gennaro Angiolo. After listening to the pitch, Whitey is said to have responded, "Alright, if they want to play checkers, we'll play chess." Another source considers it more likely that his partner Stephen Flemmi had betrayed him to the FBI. James was caught between a rock and a hard place. Either supply information to the FBI or return to federal prison. By 1979, Howie Winter and most of his organization's leadership were sentenced for fixing horse races. However, the FBI persuaded federal prosecutors to drop all charges against White and Flemmi. Whitey and Flemmi then took over the remnants of the Winter Hill Gang and used their status as informants to eliminate the competition. The information they supplied to the FBI in subsequent years was responsible for the imprisonment of several of Whitey's associates, for whom he viewed as threats. The main victims of their relationship with the federal government was the Patriarca crime family, which was based in Boston's North End and in Providence. After the 1986 RICO indictment of underboss Gennaro Angiolo and his associates, the Patriarca crime family's Boston operations were in shambles. Whitey and Flemmi stepped into the ensuing vacuum to take control of organized crime in the Boston area as well. In 1980, Whitey was approached in a South Boston saloon by Louis Lidoff, a neighborhood bookmaker. Louis's reputation as an earner made him popular with South Boston's criminal elite, and at one point police believed he was essentially running the neighborhood gambling rackets, taking in as much as $20,000 a week. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, he was considered to be one of the top bookmakers in South Boston. He was also one of the few prominent Arab Americans active in Boston's criminal underworld. Before 1976, when he began associating with the Winter Hill Gang, little is known about him, except that he was the leader of a large-scale sports gambling operation. Louis had allegedly been stealing from his partners in the bookmaking operation and using the money to traffic cocaine. In addition, he had not only refused to pay a cut of his drug profits, but had also committed 2 murders without Whitey's permission. Lidoff told an outraged Bulcher that he was also going to kill his partner, Joe the Barber, whom he falsely accused of stealing money from the bookmaking operation. Whitey refused to sanction this, but Louis vowed to kill him anyway. Seething with anger, Bulger informed Louis, "You've stepped over the line." Mobster Kevin Weeks was asked about Louis, and he stated, "Personally, I liked Louis. Every Sunday night, he had come down to Triple O's and we'd play cards or pinball, $20 a game. He was loud but funny, and he had always been a major moneymaker for Whitey. He should have just stayed a bookie and not tried to jump from the minor leagues to the majors. And now he wanted to kill a friend of Whitey's. There was no way that would be allowed. Shortly after that, a week or so before my wedding, Louis was found stuffed into a garbage bag in the trunk of his car, which had been dumped in the South End. He had been stabbed with an ice pick and shot. He was color-coordinated, Whitey told me. He was wearing green underwear and was in a green garbage bag. At the wedding, when I went around to greet his table, Whitey pointed to the empty chair beside him and said, "Say hi to Louis." Stevie picked up a napkin and made a show of wiping his face. "He keeps on drinking and it keeps on leaking out of him," he said, reminding us that Louis had been shot in the head and any drink he might have put in his mouth would pour right out of his face. And they all broke out laughing. In 1982, a South Boston cocaine dealer named Brian Halloran approached the FBI and stated that he had witnessed Whitey and Flemmi kill Louis Liddell. Meanwhile, the FBI agent was keeping Whitey and Flemmi closely briefed on what his informant was saying to the bureau. According to Kevin Weeks, Whitey and Flemmi were most enraged that Brian was falsely claiming involvement in their assassination of Tulsa, Oklahoma businessman Roger Wheeler. Ultimately, the FBI discovered of Brian's false claims and refused him and his family a place in the Witness Protection Program. Soon after, on May 11, 1982, Whitey, Flemmi and Weeks were tipped off that Brian Halloran had returned to South Boston. After arriving at the scene, Kevin Weeks staked out a restaurant where Halloran was dining. Michael Donahue of Dorchester, a construction worker, a neighbor, and friend of Halloran, incidentally ran into him at the restaurant. In a decision that would prove costly, Donahue offered Halloran a ride home. As Donahue and Halloran drove out of the parking lot, Weeks signaled to James by stating, "The balloon is in the air," over a handheld radio. Whitey drove up with a masked man armed with a silenced MAC-10, wearing a floppy hat and a long-haired wig. His other shooter then opened fire and sprayed Donahue's car with bullets. Donahue was shot in the head and killed instantly. Halloran was hit multiple times, but lived long enough to identify his attacker as James Flynn, a Winter Hill Gang associate. He was later tried and acquitted. However, Flynn would remain the prime suspect until 1999. When Kevin Weeks agreed to cooperate with investigators, he identified Whitey as one of the shooters. Stephen Flemmi later identified the second shooter as Mullen Gang leader Patrick Nee. Nee denies the allegation, and no charges were filed against him. Michael Donahue was survived by his wife and 3 sons. The Donahue and Halloran families eventually filed a civil lawsuit against the federal government after learning the FBI agent had informed Whitey of Halloran's informant status. Both families were awarded several $1 million in damages. However, the verdict was overturned on appeal due to the late filing of the claims. Thomas Donahue, who was 8 years old when his father was murdered, has become a spokesman for the families of those allegedly murdered by the gang throughout the 1980s. The Winter Hill Gang ran shakedowns throughout eastern Massachusetts. They began to get more involved with extortion, loan sharking, bookmaking, truck hijackings and arms trafficking. State and federal agencies was repeatedly stymied in their attempts to build cases against the Winter Hill Gang. This was caused by several factors. Among them was Whitey's fear of wiretaps, another was the South Boston's Code of Silence, plus corruption within the Boston Police Department, the Massachusetts State Police, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Although disgraced FBI agent John Connolly has long been Whitey's most infamous friend in law enforcement, Kevin Weeks has insisted that another lieutenant in the department was valued far more highly. According to Weeks, this was the Winter Hill Gang's only source inside the Massachusetts State Police. Whitey also began to summon drug dealers from in and around Boston to his headquarters. Flanked by Kevin Weeks and Stephen Flemmi, Whitey would inform each dealer that he had been offered a substantial sum in return for that dealer's assassination. He would then demand a large cash payment not to do so. Eventually, the massive profits of drugs proved irresistible. Winter Hill Gang. According to Kevin Weeks, "We weren't in the import business and weren't bringing in the marijuana or the cocaine. We were in the shakedown business. We didn't bring drugs in, we took money off the people who did. We never dealt with the street dealers, but rather with about a dozen large-scale drug distributors all over the state who were bringing in the drugs and paying hundreds of thousands to Whitey. The dealers on the street corners sold 8 balls and grams to customers for their personal use. They were supplied by the mid-level drug dealer who was selling them multiple ounces. In other words, the big importers gave it to the major distributors, who sold it to the middlemen, who then sold it to the street dealers. In order to get to us, they would have had to go through those 4 layers of insulation. In South Boston, most of the neighborhood's cocaine and marijuana trade was managed by John Shea. According to Weeks, Whitey briefly considered murdering Shea, but eventually decided to just shake him down, and he eventually started working with Whitey. According to Weeks, Whitey enforced strict rules over the dealers who were paying him protection. The only people we ever put out of business were heroin dealers. Whitey didn't allow heroin in South Boston. It was a dirty drug that users stuck in their arms, making problems with needles, and later on, AIDS. Well, people can do cocaine socially and still function. Once they do heroin, they're zombies. Weeks also alleges that Whitey strictly forbade PCP and selling to children, and that those dealers who refused to play by his rules were violently driven out of the neighborhood, or worse, murdered. In 1990, John Shea and his associates were arrested as part of a joint investigation involving the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Boston Police Department, and the Massachusetts State Police. They all refused to testify against a hierarchy of the Winter Hill Gang. Kevin Weeks says about the incident. Whitey lost money once the drug dealers were removed from the streets in the summer raid, but he always had other business going on. Knowing I had to build something on the side, I had concentrated on my own gambling businesses. The drug business had been good while it lasted. But our major involvement in it was over. It would not be until the 1999 cooperation of Weeks that Whitey, by then a fugitive, was conclusively linked to the drug trade by investigators. In the summer of 1991, Whitey and 3 others came into possession of the winning Massachusetts lottery ticket, which had been bought at a store he owned. The 4 men shared a prize of around $14 million. Whitey was widely thought to have obtained his share of the jackpot illegitimately. In April 1994, a joint task force launched a probe of Whitey's gambling operations. The FBI, by this time, was considered compromised and was not informed. After a number of bookmakers agreed to testify to having paid protection money to the Winter Hill Gang, a federal case was built against Whitey under the RICO Act. According to Kevin Weeks. In 1993 and 1994, before the arrest came down, James and Stevie were traveling on the French and Italian Riviera. The two of them traveled all over Europe, sometimes separating for a while. Sometimes they took girls, sometimes just the two of them went. They would rent cars and travel all through Europe. It was more preparation than anything, getting ready for another life. They didn't ask me to go, not that I would have wanted to. Jimmy had prepared for the run for years. He had established a whole other person, with a complete ID and credit cards in his new name. He had even joined associations in the name, building an entire portfolio for his alias. He had always said you had to be ready to take off on short notice. And he was. He had also set up safe deposit boxes, containing cash, jewelry, and passports, in different parts of the world. In December 1994, Whitey was informed that sealed indictments had come from the Department of Justice and that the FBI were due to make arrests during the Christmas season. In response, Whitey fled Boston on December 23, 1994, accompanied by his common-law wife, Teresa Stanley. And the hunt was on for the boss of the Winter Hill Gang.